Okay, so there's this pretty wild document making the rounds. It's basically a step-by-step playbook for how a state governor could openly defy the federal government. It's a lot. And today we're going to break down exactly what's inside. Now, this is actually the last sentence in the entire guide. We're starting with the ending because it tells you everything you need to know about the stakes. The authors don't see this as just some political strategy, right? To them, it's an urgent, almost existential mission. So, just to be super clear about what we're doing here, our goal is just to explain what's in this guide. We're going to look at its main arguments, the actions it's proposing, and how it justifies them. All of it pulled straight from the document itself. We're not here to take a side or endorse it. We're here to understand it. All right, first up, the diagnosis. Before the playbook gets to the how, the specific actions, it spends a lot of time on the why. It's like a doctor explaining the disease before prescribing the medicine. The guide is laying out its case for why it thinks these pretty radical, once unthinkable actions are now absolutely necessary. And the core premise is this. The guide basically says that the system's traditional guardrails, the courts, Congress, all those political norms we count on, they've failed. They're broken. It argues that they're just not strong enough anymore to stop what it calls America's slide into autocracy. And it gets pretty specific. The guide points its finger at three main problems. First, it claims the president is ignoring the Constitution. Second, that congressional Republicans are letting it happen. And third, and this is a huge one, that the Supreme Court isn't a neutral referee anymore, it's become a political player. Now, to back all this up, the guide does something really smart. It quotes legal experts from both sides of the aisle. So you get this warning, for example, from J. Michael Ludwig, and he's a very respected conservative former judge. By using his words, the guide is trying to make the point that, hey, this isn't just a partisan complaint. And then, right after the conservative judge, it hits you with this quote from Lawrence Tribe, who's a top-tier liberal constitutional scholar. See what they're doing? The message they want you to get is pretty clear. This isn't a left or right thing. They're saying that prominent voices from all over the political map are sounding the exact same alarm. And according to the guide, it's not just the legal eagles who are worried. They point to polling data like this to show that this is a mainstream feeling. The survey they cite from AP-NORC found that a whopping 3/4 of Americans have little to no confidence in the Supreme Court. That's a huge number. So all of this leads to the guide's big, scary conclusion for this first section. It argues that America is shifting from a rule of law, where, the law is above everyone, to a rule by law. And that's a really important distinction. It means the law is no longer a shield for the people, but a weapon for the powerful. Okay, so if the diagnosis is that bad, what's the prescription? That brings us to the next section of the guide, which is all about defining what they call red lines. These are the specific triggers, the exact moments they say would force a state to act. I mean, that's the key question, isn't it? It's one thing to sound the alarm, but it's another thing entirely to say, okay, this is the moment we fight back. The guide's answer to when is this whole concept of red lines. Think of these red lines as constitutional tripwires. The guide's argument is that if the federal government trips one of these wires, a governor isn't just allowed to act, they are obligated to act because of the oath they took to their own state's constitution. And they get very specific. Here are just a few examples of these red lines, pulled straight from the playbook. We're talking about really serious stuff, like deploying the U.S. military against its own citizens, or the federal government interfering with state-run elections. But it also includes things like restricting access to healthcare that's legal in a state, or financially punishing a state just because you don't like its politics. All right, so this brings us to the heart of it all, the playbook itself, the what to do part. If a red line gets crossed, what does a governor actually do? This next section is all about the specific tools of resistance. And it's not just one single action. The guide lays out a whole strategy with multiple fronts. We're talking legal moves, institutional changes, civic actions, and even financial pressure. Let's dive into a few of the biggest examples. Okay, so one of the biggest and most controversial ideas is for a governor to reactivate their state defense force. Now, you might be thinking, don't they have the National Guard? And that's the key. Here's why this is such a big deal. The president can federalize the National Guard, basically take control of it. But a state defense force? Legally, they can't. It answers only to the governor. All right, and this is where things get really, really pointed. Let's say a state decides to defy a federal order. What happens when federal agents, think ICE or the FBI, are operating inside that state's borders? Well, the playbook lays out a ladder of escalating steps for the state to take control. Step 1, force federal agents to wear visible ID and body cams. Step 2, require them to submit their operational plans to state authorities beforehand. And the final, most extreme step, authorize state police to actually arrest federal agents if they're acting unlawfully or don't have a proper warrant. Yeah, pretty intense. And the playbook doesn't stop there. It's got a whole toolbox of other ideas. Things like using state courts to tie up federal actions and legal knots, refusing to share state data or let federal agents use state facilities, and even creating a special account to hold federal tax dollars hostage as a bargaining chip. So you're probably asking, how on earth do they justify all this? I mean, this is radical stuff. And that brings us to the final section, which is less about tactics and more about the philosophy. It's the guide's big argument for why a governor's ultimate duty might mean breaking the law. Interestingly, the guide starts its justification by going all the way back to the beginning. It quotes Thomas Paine from 1775, laying out the foundational principle of American democracy, that in this country, the law is king. But then it immediately pivots and hits you with this counterpoint. It basically says, okay, but what happens when the law stops being a tool for justice and becomes a weapon of oppression? At that point, the guide argues, the law loses its moral authority. And that conflict, that tension right there, is the absolute core of the guide's whole argument. But, the obvious question is, why not just vote them out? Why not wait for the next election? The guide has an answer for that. It argues that modern authoritarians are smart. They don't just cancel elections anymore. Instead, they rig the game. They weaponize the whole system, the courts, the police, the bureaucracy, to make it almost impossible for them to ever lose power. And that leaves us right here with the fundamental, incredibly difficult question this whole playbook forces us to think about. If a state government truly believes the federal law has become a tool of oppression, does its duty to protect its own citizens override its duty to obey that law? The guide has a very clear answer, but for the rest of us, it leaves us standing at a pretty profound constitutional crossroads.